Right, hello and welcome to the Capula podcast, the ultimate exchange. I'm your host, Alex Maxton, an OT cybersecurity consultant here at Capula. Today's title is the OT Access Dilemma. And to do that, I'm joined by one of our partners, Cyolo. And with me is Adam Gurney. So Adam, how about you introduce yourself and introduce Cyolo?
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. So Adam Gurney, I'm one of the senior solutions engineers at Cyolo. Cyolo, if you've never heard of us, we're a cybersecurity company and we specialize in secure privileged remote access, predominantly into environments where there are OT systems, where there's ICS. And thanks for having us today.
No problem. So you would say you focus on OT cybersecurity, so you're going to be perfect here today. Right. So before we go into using remote access, before we talk about all those things, why do we need it? Why do we need remote access? Why are customers and maybe talk about, are you seeing more people open up to remote access or are you seeing people, close down?
Yeah, that's a really good question to start with. So, remote access is not a new concept. This is not something that we've just developed over the last few years. It's something that's been around for a while. I suppose what's changed is how people use it, the needs for it. We saw in COVID a huge explosion of the need to have remote access. People can't travel. Our sites, our customer environments still need the uptime. They still need maintenance support. There still needs to be a way in. So it's not necessarily a trend that's growing, but the need for strengthening that access path or that route into an environment, is really where the focus is at the moment.
Yeah, because I think it's quite interesting because I did a 6443 training course and one of the questions was like, why is remote access important? And I'm thinking to myself, why? And the answer was because you can have central engineering teams. Yep. Is that what you're seeing in the market?
Yeah, so there's a growing demand for access, both from a vendor perspective, from OEMs, machine builders, as well as the sort of in-house or on-site team needing to gain access to those critical services. So as we see more digitization, as we see the expansion of those environments, there's always going to be a growing need for people to get in and do the job. So predominantly what our customers are coming to us with is not necessarily that new challenge of we need to get someone in. It's how can we strengthen the way in which they get from an untrusted zone or maybe a public network, it could be at home, into those critical environments to get the job done.
Okay, so yeah, we can see that more and more people, like you touched on COVID, a lot of people want to work from home now. Central engineering teams don't always want to go in the office.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
you're also seeing that remote access opens up maybe the the job market portfolio, and everyone can work from home, so they can dial in and they can operate a bit more remotely and support the customer or the client in that case. So looking at remote access, obviously, so you have a solution. What would you say? Let's say start with what's the most common way that people are using remote access or implementing remote access?
Yeah, so there's probably two strands to that. There's either a solution that's been developed in-house using in-house technology, and then there's always a route in, maybe vendor provided or OEM provided, for that specific vendor to gain access to equipment that they have at that particular site. So there's likely to be a combination of VPNs, jump hosts. In some cases, it's born from the firewall. In some cases, it's sort of separate, distinct equipment to provide that remote access path. We do see a mix. There's some IT tools, the shadow IT element coming into play, where it's not quite a mandated solution from the organization, but someone's thought it's a good idea to install TeamViewer and provide a way in to get access to a particular system. But more broadly speaking, if there is going to be a remote access strategy, it's normally defined on some specific solutions and specific technologies.
So would you see that maybe remote access is sort of maybe getting a bit more of an input or a bit more heightened awareness now that you've got sort of standards that are coming in place? So a lot of our customers maybe talk about the CAF.
Yeah.
We talk about 6443.
Yeah.
How is that impacting what people do with remote access?
Yeah. So compliance and regulatory demands are often drivers for adoption. So we see that a lot. So you can't almost get away with having a VPN and a jump host to go from an external or public zone or even IT down into your operational layer. That's not ticking the boxes anymore. So 6443, CAF, ECAF, they're all drivers, but it's how that organization and their risk profile is able to sort of best manage those requirements against the technology that they can use. And that's what we see a lot of as well.
So from your knowledge, we talk about remote access. What are the biggest associated risks with remote access? Maybe that's why people aren't adverse to doing. What are you seeing? Those risks?
So the way I always look at remote access, if done incorrectly, you can open up a big problem. With remote access, whilst we talk about remote access being a user who's remote getting access internally, that's not always the case. Remote access is, just from a less secure zone to a higher secure zone, high security zone. So it might only be used internally, within the confines of a premise, rather than someone sitting at home. So in terms of risks, it really depends on, what the needs of the business are, where those users are sited, whether they're in a service center in Germany, for example, or whether they are, coming from the building next door that happens to be within that security environment. So really, misconfiguration, vulnerabilities, they're all associated factors that we have to consider. And obviously that's what we at Cyolo do. We try and, address some of those, heighten that security and have a really good risk mitigation there.
So you mentioned there that remote access isn't just about external. Remote access is IT, because IT is external to your OT environment.
Yes.
So what does secure really mean to you for remote access?
So in the context of OT, we need to ensure that our engineers, our automation technicians are able to securely connect to those devices in the process network, in the OT zones, over secure channels. So they can only interact with systems that they've been granted access to. So for secure from a Cyolo perspective is very much around, only ensuring that specific channels, specific protocols, very fine-grained access can be granted, but enough for them to get the job done. We don't want to be, and nor do our customers want technology to be a disruptor or, in any kind of way hinder the ability for someone to get in and do a job, whether it's to make a change, whether it's to monitor, or whether it's to, just facilitate the normal business use.
Okay, so you've spoken about, we touched on the different methods that we can use at the moment. You got, you talk about VPNs, you talk about jump hosts. One thing you guys talk a lot about is like VPN-less. Can you explain a bit about that and how, just to me, from a security point of view, VPN, what does that mean,
Yeah. So, VPNs have been around for a while. They've always done a good job. I will always say that, VPNs allowing a user to establish a connection from an external zone to an internal zone over a secure tunnel, you'd think would do the job. As the world is moving and as we're trying to adopt these more zero trust principles, not trusting the network the user's coming from, not trusting the device they're on, and not necessarily trusting that identity per se, we're having to close off those communication channels to be really fine-grained. But in doing so, we're often limiting the ability for that user to come in and do what they need to do. So you see a lot of technology now that's more browser-focused or browser-based, but having a browser and having a connection established from a web browser, might hinder that ability to run, engineering software on their laptop, being able to connect down into equipment in the OT zone. With Cyolo, we do things slightly differently, and our approach is very much around creating fine-grained tunnels, still allow that user to connect in, but it's all browser initiated. So we've still got that control layer, but we can still, allow that user to get in and get the job done.
Okay, so you still have an access from one device to another device. It's just all through a browser controlled.
Absolutely, and it's all very fine-grained. So instead of, as we know with VPNs, you dial in, you have broad network access depending on where you're landing. With Cyolo, it's very different. It's very much on a specific pinhole, TCP or UDP port, again, specific to that application in some cases. So it's very difficult to then break out and have those sort of lateral movement challenges.
Yeah, so just a bit of a technical question for me, from a firewall configuration point of view, how do you implement that from a firewall? Because it sounds like you've got one machine, and though it's so granular, and you, like you say, you can have connections to different devices. How do you control that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. If we have the deployment of a Cyolo IDAC, for example, in a DMZ or at level 3 in the OT network, that acts as a controller. So that controller in that place would be able to direct traffic, again, depending on the demands of the connection that's coming in, to allow maybe a TCP 102 connection down to a PLC, but not allow that user to access another IP on that subnet over a different port. So the IDAC in Cyolo's case would do that orchestration and allow that traffic rather than the broader network access that we see with VPNs today.
And how is that in the future now? We're seeing a lot of people talk about zero trust. Sort of, I want one sentence from you quickly. What is zero trust to you? And then we'll talk about how it affects remote access.
Yeah. So zero trust, obviously, it's an often overused word, certainly over the last few years. But from a Cyolo perspective, it's very much around, ensuring that, no user, no device, and depending on the context, is allowed to access anything unless, explicitly granted. So, we look at the principle of least privilege, ensuring that identities can only connect once they have been authenticated and once they can, either guarantee that they are who they are through MFA, guarantee that the device is compliant. Only then will they be able to establish those connections down that have been, configured by an administrator.
Okay. So talking about organizations, what can they do now? And then what could they do in the future?
Yeah. So the way I would see it, and my advice to our customers and our partners is always, this does not need to be a major project. It does not need a huge amount of resource to lower your risk, but increase your security. When we look at a journey for zero trust with remote access or with privileged access in mind, it can be done very piecemeal. It can be done in digestible pieces. So, if you don't already have a DMZ between your IT and your OT, put one in. If you don't already have MFA for remote access accounts, that needs to be implemented. If you don't already have the ability to govern which identities can connect to which services, that can be layered on. So it can be very much a layered approach rather than having to go from a situation today to the sort of, utopia of full-on zero trust for privileged access. So, we at Cyolo, we help with that. But it can be very much done as sort of, small chunks, and you're just increasing your security at every stage.
Yeah, and I suppose, again, one of those big topics we saw about zero trust, it's battered around. I think the new one is going to be AI, isn't it? I think it definitely is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that something that you see coming into remote access, and how will it be seen?
It's definitely not going to come in. So there will always be a need to take advantage of it, or there'll always be a drive to take advantage of it. The capabilities are there. Again, from a Cyolo perspective, the way we operate is very much, the customer data needs to stay in the perimeter, needs to stay within that OT boundary. So, that's of paramount importance to us. So, leveraging, large scale cloud LLMs and harnessing big data in the cloud is not something that we're going to be able to necessarily bring to our customers, but utilizing the technology to, lower risk through things like session auditing and viewing screen recordings and determining if something risky has happened is really the direction that we're looking to take that technology in. So, for example, Alex, if you'd logged into a workstation, you'd spent 8 hours doing some stuff on there, and no one's going to sit there and watch that video for 8 hours. They've got better things to do. But if you opened up, I don't know, regedit and started making some commands on an engineering workstation, that might be deemed risky. AI is going to help us determine, what those sort of more risky actions or things that are done in there. That will help guide someone who's interested in your session to look in the right place at the right time for where things might be, again, more high-end risk.
So it's essentially like a remote access monitoring solution.
Yeah, so we're taking, again, auditing, recording, sort of into more an analytical stage, but, harnessing AI to do that.
So you're speaking about remote access isn't just external, it's That's internal right. as well.
Yeah.
Let's just expand a bit more on that. What are those different methods, and how can you explain them?
So, as I say, remote access isn't always a user sitting outside the perimeter and having to come in and get the job done. It can look very different depending on the organization, depending on their risk profile, and the methods used today. So not having a big bang shift from this is how we're operating to how we're operating tomorrow. So a nuclear power site is going to be very different to a manufacturer, for example. Their risk profile will dictate how that access can be granted, and obviously in the nuclear case, probably not at all. So the technology really has to be adaptable to, again, how that organization operates. And where we see, some organizations, remote access looks like using a zero trust privilege access tool, or when you're within the company building. So going from one zone to another. They still have the control to ensure that user can only go to these assets, but it's done in a much more controlled fashion, not out over the public internet.
I suppose if we look at remote access, and it's maybe not just organizational, isn't it? It's remote access. There's also the different types and different requirements of the users.
Yes.
What sort of what maybe do you have some examples of what different users need and how you do that?
Yeah, exactly. So again, very, very varying degrees of what do I need to get access to in order to get the job done will depend on, the persona that we're working with. So, an engineer might need access to specific tools and the OT, the automation equipment, whereas someone, involved in the billing, for example, might only need access to a monitoring platform. So that can vary, very differently depending on a web page and access to a PLC, for example. So having a solution that will tailor to both, but still apply the same level of control, is of the utmost importance as well.
Yeah, and I suppose if we're talking, we're going to talk about the risks in a second. What are the risks in terms of, implementing these remote access solutions? Because you've got varying degrees there. You've got maybe a trained engineer, but you've also maybe got a financial person who just wants to visualize data. Yeah. How is that? Is that a big risk that we're seeing in remote access?
It is a big risk, and it has been a big risk for a while because, again, it only takes one misconfiguration before you've allowed someone who shouldn't be granted access to certain resources to give them access to certain resources. We see that a lot, and that is often down to humans. It's often down to the people maintaining these environments. That's a big challenge. So having a platform in place that can more easily visualize those changes or where those risks are is really where we're seeing this, our customers' journey going on and giving them that ability to more finely grain which users can access which services, and then you're less likely of having a scenario where someone has too much access, which is what we're keen to avoid.
Right. Thank you, Adam, for that piece of information. Thank you for joining us. That brings us to the end of the OT Access Dilemma podcast. And before you go, what one piece of advice can you give the person who's listening to this now? What can they do for remote access?
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks for having me, Alex. I suppose the first and most important piece of advice is, firstly, find out all your access paths. Find out how people are able to get into your critical networks today, whether that's through approved methods, whether that's using sort of shadow IT tools, and have a really good audit over that. Only once you know how people are getting in can you look to strengthen the paths in which they're able to gain access. And only from then are you able to sort of layer on policies as to, defining who can access which systems and really, solidifying those defenses.
Yeah, and I think that's it, isn't it? We talk about that a lot in security, and it seems to be the same theme, doesn't it? Understand what you've got before you go out there. You're not going to implement a good remote access solution or any sort of security by just going out there and buying something. You've got to understand and give you guys that. So yes, thank you again, Adam, and thank you for joining us from Cyolo.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
That's the end of this Capula podcast, the OT Access Dilemma. If you're interested in understanding more about your OT environment, please get in contact with us at www.capula.com, or you can get in touch with us through LinkedIn. That's the end of this podcast. Thank you. Goodbye.